Commentary. It's hard to believe that I've been writing for the Epoch Times for 4.5 years now. During that time, I've focused the majority of my articles around the motion picture production code, which was the theme of my first article, The Key to the Golden Era of Hollywood. Before writing for this publication, I had a blog on the same subject for years called the Pure Entertainment Preservation Society, or PEPS. My first blog post was called, The Production Code of 1930's Impact on America, and it had a similar theme to the first article. The production code is the reason behind the golden era of Hollywood's acclaimed yet decent entertainment. I started the blog with my younger sister, Rebecca. That first article began as a 3,000-word research paper we wrote during the summer as the climax of a writing course. On October 17, 2016, we decided to publish it as the first entry on our WordPress blog. During the 3 years between starting that blog and having my first article published by the Epoch Times, I read a lot about the code, and I wrote a lot about it, too. My opinion on the code's value and influence on films didn't change during that time. However, looking back on that first article, I realized that the way I talk about the code in classic films has changed. The censorship issue. The research paper started with a long, detailed opening paragraph outlining the theme. What's wrong with the modern American cinema? Out of the top 20 films in 2015, why were 12 rated R, 6 rated PG-13, and not 1 rated G? The reason for these depressing statistics is a simple one: films are merely rated but not censored. In other words, all obscene content is allowed as long as audiences are warned of it. Many people complain about the shocking content of nearly every film released in this country, and moral Americans dream about times in the past when they could go to the theater and see good films. Not even all senior citizens remember a time when every film was decent. Sometimes it is hard to believe there ever was such a time. A look at films from the past, however, reassures one's faith in the power of propriety in the cinema. If one looks earlier in time, one may be surprised to discover that films in the 20s and early 30s contained immoral elements similar to those seen in the 1960s. Why, then, were films so conservative and moral only a few years later? The answer to this question is surprisingly simple. From 1934 to 1954, Joseph I. Green, a conservative Catholic layman, oversaw the Production Code Administration, which strictly enforced the Motion Picture Production Code of 1930. But what is this code, and how did it produce the miracle of films which adhere to strong Christian principles? Read on to learn the fascinating story of loose early films, Hollywood's golden age, its tragic demise, and the hope this time gives for the future. Besides a few punctuation styles, I could have written that paragraph yesterday. As a 15-year-old high school graduate, I had already developed my writing style. The ideas presented in that paragraph are points that I make in many of my current articles. The choice which strikes me is my use of the word, censored. Throughout this paper, I used some form of the word, censor, 14 times. Half of these times are referring to the code and its enforcement as censorship. It's not surprising that I would use that word, since it's included in the titles of most books on the topic. As I learned more about the code and the men who wrote and enforced it, I discovered that they hated for their work to be referred to as censorship. Instead, they preferred the term, self-regulation. Apparently, I discovered this by January 2017, since the 13th blog post addressed the issue of whether the code was censorship. In an article published on January 7 entitled, The First Amendment in the Code, I addressed the difference between government censorship and what the code did, explaining why it didn't conflict with the constitutional freedom of speech. This changed wording was largely inspired by the responses and reactions I received during my first months as a vocal proponent of the code's virtues. From 2017 onward, I've never used the word censorship, or any of its derivatives, including the oxymoron, self-censorship, when talking about the code, unless I'm explaining how it differs from true censorship. A cultural phenomenon. Besides the erroneous usages of the word censorship, the rest of the essay is a very detailed but accurate account of film content regulation in America, starting with the Supreme Court case ruling in 1915 which exempted films from First Amendment protection. As the essay explains, this would lead to the formation of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America in 1927, the adoption of the code in 1930, and the formation of the Production Code Administration (PCA) in 1934. Where the essay differed from the standard writings on this subject is its inference that the code's enforcement shaped the artistic quality of entertainment and, as a result, American culture during the Great Depression and beyond.